crime-free, perfect city. John Goodman is just not going to do that. And most of the stuff, you know, like the violent stuff, the rapes, I would guess that happened to somebody.
Not to a bar owner.
No.
Okay, because everybody has a gun who works at a bar.
Yeah, you're
I mean,
right.
That whole thing was like,
You're right.
It was just, you know, but I think that the comparison for Treme is, I mean, from Treme to The Wire, doesn't translate for me. It doesn't translate for me to say that David Simon, as gifted as he was with The Wire, is anything like Raleigh. They're just two different, and what has happened with Treme, because the storyline is so bad, is, you know, makes me think, what's wrong with David Simon? He hasn't picked up and done something with this.
Yeah, well, the gun is a good point. She should have had a gun. Maybe she did have a gun and didn't have time to reach for it.
No.
See, wait, I want to respond to that. I used to live here before Katrina, and I left right before the storm, and I've come back. But I didn't. But as like someone who's watched the show, like I think he has given like lots of talks and written lots of things that sometimes he has to sacrifice facts for the sake of the story. And you might think that everybody in the city who's watching her has a gun, but they might not, or they might. But like he's sacrificing
I
on
actually
behalf of the
know.
story.
I mean, if you work in the liquor industry at night, you have a gun.
Right, but I guess my point is that he's going to like that's been, I think, some of the complaints about the show. I mean, that I've read locally that, oh, well, this, you know, the whole thing with the pie that was reheated in the first episode, and everyone knows that the pie wasn't ready for 6 months. I'm like, I didn't know that, you know. And I think like we think about this show as people who live in New Orleans or the diaspora of New Orleans, but like there's people, I always wonder about people who watch the show that have never been to New Orleans, and the story is going to matter to them more, where we're like, oh, wait, that street isn't like that. Why are they saying that's this street? We know it's this street, you know. And I think that, I wonder if we get so bogged down, like maybe you're fixating on the, and I'm sorry, not to push you out, but, you know, we all fixate on the details that they might get wrong, but I think sometimes, you know, he has to get that wrong to sacrifice the story. I think Matt Weiner, who does Mad Men, it's a similar thing, but there's like a fetishism of the detail of, oh, this actually happened in 1965, but then people get upset because they don't, I think people don't get upset about Mad Men because those details are a little bit hazier. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I feel like the story isn't as minded, or isn't attacked as much, or you were saying you don't like the story, but I see in the community people are just attacking the details, and it's so personal that I understand that, but at the same time, I'm like, well, don't you understand it is fiction, it is like he is trying to tell a story above all. And I mean, there was this recent thing, I don't know if everybody knows about, this storyteller who, he told a story about the Apple factories in China, and it was a big hubbub because the essence of the story is true, but he made up lots of details specific to his story, like people he spoke with, and a lot of what so like the overall thing he was saying was that there's, you know, that people aren't treated fairly in these conditions, and then when people attacked him for saying, well, the details of your story were wrong, it's like, well, I'm a storyteller, and I think that that's what it, you know, when we sit here and argue over the details, it's like David Simon will always say, I'm a storyteller.
You know, on the point about arguing over details, I think post-Katrina, people are dying for normalcy, and all we're served up instead is yet another school's name is changed, change the street name, change. It's just constant sort of an external imposition of a culture that is not New Orleanian on New Orleanians, and we're sort of expected to like put up with it. So I think that might be one reason why people are, also because there's just like, in New Orleans, there's just such a tremendous pride in this city, and that's why it makes it so much more like why people might care, you know, about these details being just right, because this is one thing that people can hang on to, and ironically to me, it's one thing that the new people who've come to New Orleans post-Katrina have almost in common with people who've been here forever, and that is the sheer love of the city. And I find that connection to be magical and amazing. I don't really know what good will come of it. I haven't really seen that. I feel it kind of, but I don't know.
Has there been also, because when I read the Vibe of the Talk, I was wondering if you were going to speak on, like, I mean, I've seen it, you know, like the Spotted Cat at the Rue, it's like this was the place in Treme, like, has there been, what's been the actual like economic impact of the show?
Well, it's really hard. If you want to talk about what the economic impact of any film production is, it's really loosey-goosey, right? So the tax credit in Louisiana is more generous than anywhere else in the U.S. It's 30% of your investment plus 5% for what's called local labor. So up to 35% of everything that's spent on a production comes back to the studio in the form of a tax credit that then gets sold for, some percentage of that amount, right? Somebody releases somebody else's tax burden. And as we know, the state hasn't been auditing who's buying those tax credits, though I have my guesses as to who needs to offset tax burdens in this state. So that's the first thing, right? It's like whatever money is being generated, you have to discount all the tax money that the state isn't taking in, which is probably in the neighborhood of, I want to say, I'm just pulling this out right now, but I would guess somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 million of tax credits, right? No, sorry, 30 million in expenditures, 1/3 of that, 10 million in still a chunk of change. Whether the room makes anything towards that,
Right.
So that's difficult. I will say that Treme is better than a lot of other productions in giving back to the local economy, the philanthropy, the fundraiser benefits. At one point they did a jobs training workshop for people in the film industry, which is something none of the studios will invest in, and the state has defunded, right, is actually training the laborers to work for these productions. So that's another way that this film economy is it's a little bit twisted, because what counts as local labor is mostly people coming in from out of state. And if you work 30 days on a production in Louisiana, you become local labor. So it's unclear to me what's local labor.
But they're not going to get a cameraman or a soundman here, probably.
They could, because we used to have a film training program through the New Orleans Video Access Center, NOVAC, which still runs classes out in the Bywater, which is one of the main locations, I believe, that below-the-line workers work. So UNO has a very good training program. There is...
But they want somebody with track record. If it's a $70 million
there's so many
film.
productions here, you can get a track record, right? I'm constantly I'm in a media studies department, and I've got studios, folks out the wazoo contacting me, please can I have your free students to work as underpaid intern labor, which is how you get your chits in the Hollywood industries, working for free, working your way up. Louisiana could have really deep local labor, but none of these productions, with the exception of Treme, has invested in a training program for local labor. They did it one season through NOVAC, and then they discontinued it, which is kind of why I was wondering, why did they discontinue the local screenings as well? Because it seems like there were a lot of things going on in the first season that in the second season, I'm thinking budget cuts through HBO, I don't know, hasn't happened. So I don't know if anyone has a connection that can help me answer this, because they were really, in some ways, they were making the best of a bad situation, right? It's not a great economic proposition for a city to just be a location if they can't get labor and other things investment out of it. So they were at least trying, and now I don't know what happened. I think they did decide that the best bang for their buck in terms of marketing was to raise money for musicians over film labor. So that's I think one way that that impact has been analyzed by the Times-Picayune, how much money they've raised for Musician Coalition.